This is Mark Johnson at the Liberty Agenda, and we'll talk about the Revolutionary War period and the lead up to it. In the 3 previous videos, I described in some detail the dramatic events that immediately preceded the Declaration, leaving out the Battle of New York and Long Island. During that period, was really when July 4th, 1776 occurred and the Declaration was announced to the public and to the world. But before that, we talked about Lexington, Concord, and the Battle of Boston. In this video, I will backtrack in time to describe the events which took place over a much longer period of time, but which provide a very important and relevant context for why the events at Lexington and Boston make sense. In particular, I'll focus on the period from around 1760 through the Boston Tea Party of March 1774, a period of about 15 years. And I'll place even this period in a much larger context, the period of approximately 1620 through 1760, a span of time of about 80 years. So much of what we learn in school about the Boston Tea Party, the Battle of Lexington, the ride of Paul Revere, even the Battle of Bunker Hill, we don't really have, from my recollection, from my school years, even my history classes in college, I don't recall these being covered in a manner that really conveyed the true context of the time and what those people at that time were experiencing. And so that's part of the reason, or that's the main reason I want to go into this period and focus on this, because I think this is an important missing piece. In this video, I won't be able to cover that whole period. There'll probably have to be at least one more video, but here I'll talk about briefly the longer span of time from 1620 through 1760. And I'll focus on from about 1760 through 1765. This is when you may have heard of the Stamp Act, but there was also another tax or duties that were the Navigation and Trade Act that was called the Sugar Act, which preceded the Stamp Act. And we'll talk a little bit about those. The social contract that existed in the colonies prior to the Revolution was not necessarily formal, but it was real. And I think that if we read the second paragraph, or the most important part of the second paragraph of the Declaration, we can actually see the social contract that the United States was based on. I'll just read this. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And we hear this repeated many times in our reading and some of the discussion about the Declaration and about this period, but it really can't be overemphasized how critical these couple of sentences, this one sentence actually broken up into subsections, is in articulating what the foundation of our society was meant to be. The social contract, really describes the relationship between the people and the government that they choose to rule over them, and defines the relationship between those two and the rights and duties of both. And so this was the first time in human history where it was so clearly delineated that human beings have certain natural rights under natural law, and that only certain rights would be delegated to the government, and that the government would be there to protect those rights, essentially summarized as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. sometimes people will use the pursuit of happiness to add in, property rights. But nonetheless, property rights, as far as John Locke was concerned, and John Locke was a huge influence on their thinking, had to do with our life itself, because we put labor into the things that we accumulate, into the wealth we may have. And so part of ourselves and our time, and really life is just consists of time, is invested in that property. In any case, that paragraph or that sentence really defines it. The second part of this isn't often read, but I think that it's good to go through this. It says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. And so, in the Declaration, it really does go through in quite a lot of detail exactly what the colonies had experienced over many, many decades, and why they felt that the government and the relationship between Britain and the colonies was no longer acceptable. The social compact, based on the rights of the individual, that existed in the colonies actually evolved over a period of many decades, long before 1776. Throughout the 17th century, the impulse towards and a belief in the liberty of the individual, in fact, the sovereignty of the individual, was present in the attitude of the colonists in their actions toward colonial government and in their response to the various trade and navigation acts of Britain. And I've mentioned this probably briefly before, but the very act of emigrating to the United States demonstrated something that these people wanted. It wasn't like a job. It was really seeking not only opportunity but liberty itself, religious liberty, social liberty, and really hope. They were looking on a way to advanced and really a different kind of life, and freedom was a big part of that. But these values held by the colonists were believed by them to be consistent with the British Constitution as expressed in 1688. And this was the period of time that the British became more driven by a parliamentary form of government, where the authority of the king, of the crown, was lessened. And so became much more, and even the emphasis at that time was much more on liberty and individual rights. As time went on, Britain became much less focused on individual rights, at least to a large extent, and they become more centric on a government-run society, and a society governed by the class structure, the aristocracy, the gentry, and the various layers of society. But in the colonies, this idea, which actually began even in Britain in 1688, this idea of individual liberty never was lost. And so those people believed that government should have a limited role in their lives and really be there only to protect, life, liberty, and happiness. The idea of rebellion or separation from England was really far from their minds up to the last minute. for the first 60 years, certainly, of the 17th century, following the period of the French and Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763. That period of time created economic stress on Britain, and at that time was also the accession of the throne of George III. This was the starting point where a series of developments started to reveal to some people the untenable nature of the theory of empire that was in play. These factors, in conjunction with the developments of 1763 to 1776, led to an increasing and irrevocable drive in the colonial America to a separation from England. So what you see in that period of time was England had spent a tremendous amount of money in the French and Indian War protecting the American frontier. And so there was a lot of concern at that time for the economy, the basic economy of Britain, and there was a need to find a way to gain revenue out of the states or out of the colonies. And this was not a situation that was quite so pronounced prior to this, in the decades prior to this. But the 100 Years' War, the many battles and skirmishes between the French Empire and the British Empire had more or less drained their treasuries. It's significant that the power of these theoretical or ideological fissures were not much recognized or appreciated during the 85 years prior to 1776. The theory of empire was really a mercantilistic way of expansion, and the various colonies throughout these countries like Spain and France and Britain were using these colonies as economic assets. It's kind of suggestive that the ideas that we use to base our government can evolve over time in such a way that we don't really fully appreciate how these concepts actually influence the way we live, the way we're governed, and the relationship we have with our government. And so I would suggest that today there are ideological undercurrents that exist, that have existed for some time in relation to the contemporary American scene, in particular in regard to the collectivist, socialist, statist ideologies that swept across Europe and into America at the beginning of the 20th century and persisted throughout the 20th century. And while there were a lot of people that felt that these were innovations, these were good innovations that would bring somehow more security and certain benefits to society, I think that we have learned since then in many of the examples of socialist kinds of governments that these forms of governance don't work in the way that they're designed or wanted. And so that oftentimes, in every case so far that we've seen, liberty is sacrificed in the interest of a collective or a social good or a broader good, in the good of a group. So going back to the pre-revolutionary period, so 1754 to 1764, that's a typo. That was a key juncture, as I mentioned, in a series of events that led to the break with Britain. The situation between Britain and Spain and France was really a struggle for global power, which we see today among the major powers of the earth. And there was a constant interplay for many decades between Britain and France and Spain, in particular between Britain and France. And so all of this was very expensive and resource intensive as they attempted to establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere and even in other parts of the world. So You had this incipient colonial period, which was beginning, and the whole theory of the relationship between the government and its colonies was what was involved in the situation with the United States, or with the colonies of America and Britain. So the mercantilist theory of empire, which I think was common among these world powers, was viewed, basically had the colonies were being viewed by their home governments as little more than economic interests and assets. The population of these were mainly viewed in functional terms as opposed to that of fellow citizens, or as opposed to being viewed on an equal social standing with Britons in general, and the ruling class in particular. This was entirely in line with the theory of empire, in effect, and defined a subservient relationship between the colonies and the seat of the empire. And I think that, some of this was natural. You had in some places like India, or in the West Indies, where you had a lot of slaves, or you had, native peoples maybe that were there, especially in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. There were Indians and native peoples. And even in the colonies, you had a much different kind of culture, less sophistication, less, of the kind of societal enculturation that you had in Britain and in Europe. And so there was a big difference between the values, the temperament, the whole way that people behaved. So it was easy for the Europeans to look down on people that occupied these colonies. And the American colonies, however, evolved a culture, a society, and an identity that was really at odds with the role defined for them under the theory of empire that they lived by under their British rulers. As I mentioned earlier, this self-identity was based on freedom and on the social compact that was not formally documented, but still people believed in the kind of freedom which came naturally. This was incipient in the colonists when they came to North America, and looking for greater opportunities for liberty and prosperity. As I mentioned, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, this was one of these periods of conflict between England and France. The North American theater of that war was called the French-Indian War. So you had the western frontier and the northern frontier of the colonies where France was establishing itself, and then you had a battle between Britain and France, and you had to have soldiers and armies involved in trying to protect and establish those frontiers. But after this was accomplished, increasingly the British government, and even the French government, but even more so the British, they were becoming financially exhausted. And so it was more and more difficult to establish the financial base of the country on a sound foundation. For Britain, this meant that they wanted to leverage the American colonies, the West Indies colonies, and East India Company colonial assets. So I've got a map here somewhere that I'll show you that shows you a little bit what West Indies actually means. We don't call them that now. By the 1760s, the American colonies were relatively prosperous. The Americans enjoyed a mixed economy. They had good seaports in Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and basically a culture of hardworking, frugal, diligent, disciplined people. There were certainly illimitable prospects for the future, and so people basically had as much work as they wanted. They had as much opportunity as they were willing to work for, and so you had this sort of unlimited potential for the future and hope for the future. It didn't mean there wasn't going to be fluctuations and economic disruptions. It wasn't quite the same as we think of as society today. There could be disruptions of trade. There could be other things that would affect the economies in local areas. You had different kinds of economy in the Northeast as opposed to what you may have had in the South. But nonetheless, there were economic depressions even that would happen from time to time. So even though they were prosperous and there was much future growth anticipated and hope for the future, it would be inaccurate to call the colonies having boundless wealth at that time. They had to work very hard to have what they had, and yet it was a land of freedom and opportunity. The British people that were here, the governors and the people that might visit here and so on, would see these seaport areas, and they would have a very wealthy sort of merchant class. So their perspective and their observation was that maybe the colonies were much more wealthy and much more luxurious than perhaps they really were. After all, 90 or 95% of the population were agrarian farmers, and certainly these people did not live in a luxurious or ostentatious manner. A lot of the trade that happened, even though a substantial amount of it was outside the rules of the British Empire mercantile law, happened between the colonies and the West Indies. And this map sort of shows where the ownership was. So you see these orange areas were Spain, the red or brownish areas were British, and then you can't really see them, but there's some French areas and some Dutch areas. And so in the little box on the side, I have the British Virgin Islands, and then some of the islands that are associated with that island chain going down into the northern part of South America. So this area here, the area is, I guess, essentially where Columbus originally established a foothold. There was a tremendous amount of trade going on in this area, and plantations and this kind of thing. So this was the backdrop of the situation as it began in the 1760s. The American people and their relationship with the government always had were always pushing for less restrictions, for more representation, and essentially the governors and the privy councils that were governing the colonies were always basically on their heels, because the people had right there in their face, they had the ability to lobby for certain kinds of latitude on how they did things. They pushed for representation in the assembly. They pushed for having control of the cost of government, so that they didn't have what they would call lists or people that were there and paid for out of, let's say, government revenues and so on. So these things were constantly establishing this social contract where freedom and latitude and the ability to control their own destiny was built into American society at that time throughout the 17th century. There were trade and navigation acts. The Molasses Act of 1733 was set up to control what kinds of sugar products would be traded, where they would be traded from. So you had in Jamaica, that area, there was, and maybe some other islands in the West Indies were British owned, and they were not supposed to trade with non-British empire entities. And yet lots of this kind of trade happened. They traded with, for example, France had big sugar plantations, and they didn't have as much of a need to export sugar back to Europe. And so the American colonies were more than happy to sort of have the sugar dumped on them at a cheap price, rather than paying the difference in price to buy it from the British West Indies. So this was mainly affecting the northern colonies. It affected the production of rum, and it was really a way for them to, again, make more money, to enhance their own prosperity, and so on. And this was sort of looked, the British government and the enforcement of these trade and navigation acts was sort of looked the other way. They called it this sort of benign neglect or salutary neglect. They basically allowed the colonies through most of the 17th century, at least the first half, to do what they wanted to do, and there wasn't really a strict enforcement. And so a lot of the prosperity that they had was because of this freewheeling trade and some other things that were going on. They were trading with the Dutch as well, and they were also doing some things with privateering, which is a whole different subject, which is sort of legalized piracy, because they were, a lot of countries would probably try to trade here, and if they could capture these ships with lots of goods, they could basically just haul the goods off and say, well, you're not here legally, and so we're just going to take possession. So there was a lot of this privateering going on, and there was a lot of wealth accumulation by certain groups that were taking advantage of that opportunity. So the Molasses Act of 1733 was controlling the sugar, and it was set to expire in 1763, 30 years later. So in 1763, this was really judged as a good time by the British to sort of re-up this, the Sugar Act or the Molasses Act. And so they initiated something they called the Sugar Act, which was a way of controlling, again, where they traded sugar. And hopefully what they were trying to do was, at this point, enforce these trade and navigation rules so that they had to use the sugar that was produced in the British West Indies. What they would have to do at that point, though, was put in much more rigid kinds of things to enforce the laws and force kind of the Americans to purchase the sugar in that way or from those sources. The Sugar Act of 1763, again, was intended to start increasing revenues to the British Treasury, but it raised, even though the act itself was not going to be a substantial source of revenue, it was sort of a beginning point and a way to start. In a way, it sent a message. Maybe it wasn't intended to send a message, but I think Britain probably understood there would be some pushback. But the colonies also saw this as a message, and this was a red flag. They rightly saw this as a precursor to who knew how much more further kinds of trade restrictions and enforcement that might be coming down the road. I think the intent of the act was also, clear to them when they saw that they were going to have these admiralty courts, basically the sea protection that would be there to prevent sort of smuggling, and then you would have judges that would be paid by the enforcement, so they would be getting bounties. So if you enforce these trade laws, the judges were motivated by these 5% bounties on the products, and so there was real concern that they were going to really enforce this at this point, and this was going to have an effect on their profits, and it was also going to have an effect on the amount of specie currency in the colonies. Specie was the actual English currency or French currency. Sometimes this would be in the form of gold or silver coins, or it might be in even paper currency, but this was hard currency as opposed to something that was created in the colonies. And there was always a shortage of specie currency, and so that made it difficult for them to trade properly, but they always had to pay their debts to countries like France or Britain with specie. And so what they had done was try to print their own currency, even though this had been outlawed, but they didn't have enough specie currency to really do business in the way that they needed to. And so they got a lot of the specie currency through their trade with the West Indies, in particular with the French West Indies, where the sugar came from. And so there was real concern that this would also affect their economy and then their operations. So as I mentioned, there would be a nominal increase in the revenue from the Sugar Act, but it wouldn't really be enough. And it turns out, and this was always the theme, is that smuggling would continue to be done. It was difficult to enforce, as it turned out, and so there would continue to be smuggling and workarounds to get sugar from the places they wanted to. So in 1765, eventually the British government realized that the Sugar Act wasn't going to get them enough revenue. It never was, and it really wasn't working as well as they wanted. And so they initiated another act called the Stamp Act, and that was approved by Parliament. Similar to the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act was not going to resolve their financial concerns in Britain, but it was a way to start or to continue that process. The Sugar Act was perceived by some as a maneuver by the British West Indies to advance their own interests, and colonists saw the Stamp Act as clearly directed by the British government at the American colonies. So when the Sugar Act was initiated, the colonies didn't fully know what the motivation behind it was. They thought there were maybe lobby between the merchants and the powers back in Britain to make sure that the colonies purchased their sugar from the British plantations. And so it wasn't clear to everyone, although I think some people, such as Sam Adams, knew that the real motivation behind this was Britain, but it wasn't widely known. And so there was sort of it moderated the response, even though people were suspicious of what was going on and resented it in some ways. It didn't have a huge backlash of effect. Let's see here. But the Stamp Act was more clearly directed at the colonies, and there was no ambiguity about that. Even though the Stamp Act itself was a moderate measure, it, again, like the Sugar Act, it created a huge hostile reaction on the part of the colonial people because they knew what this represented for the future. Like I say here, also the colony saw the measure in the context of other impositions, such as the prohibition on the issuance of colonial currency, and in the midst of a depression, it was a clear signal of a trend that was perceived as just one more encroachment and an attack on the American economic welfare. So, again, it was more the trend that they were seeing, and there was also, I think they recognized that there was sort of this undertow by some people that the British government wanted to keep the colonies down. There were laws that there was the Declaratory Act, which said they couldn't expand west of a certain boundary on the western seaboard there, and I think it's the Alleghenies. And so they felt that they were being sort of clamped down and controlled, and that those control mechanisms were not only going to control their expansion, it was going to control their economy, and it was going to sort of move them into a position where they had fewer and fewer options and fewer opportunities. And so this was going to make them into even more to a kind of a slave condition. And so this was the fear that people began to have. So I think that's all I have time for this time, but I think you'll see in the next video that the reaction to the Stamp Act was actually quite significant. Again, it was completely unanticipated how violent and how hostile and how angry the American colonies became by this measure. The British government and the British people felt betrayed. Benjamin Franklin, who was an agent of the colonies in London, he himself did not expect the Stamp Act to create that kind of a reaction, but it was a precursor to what was going to happen later as the government of England tried to continue its policy of implementing and enforcing this mercantile theory of empire, and to bring the colonies in line with that whole idea.